I'd like to invite the panelists. So Theresa, yes, Michelle, Billy, Pam, Alex. Nope, not really. I mean, just as you're comfortable. Make sure, please, that you turn your mics on. All right. Fantastic. So we're going to be talking about the impact of RDCA-DAP as a platform. And I'll probably start with Pam, because you, from the North perspective, you have the most important vantage point of the individuals and their families living with rare diseases. And so one of the things that I would like you to comment on is how RDCA-DAP, from your perspective, has met one of the most important asks from those individuals, which is, please help me maximize the time and the effort that I put in by participating in research to make sure that the data that comes from my participation in research has maximum utility beyond the primary analysis of a single study. Can you comment on that?
Sure, thank you. I had a tickle in my throat before we walked in, so I apologize. I have a candy in my mouth. Not the greatest timing, but we continue on. Absolutely, I think there is an expectation, if speaking from a personal experience, that when your information is collected, that you have a desire to ensure that you have as many shots on goal as possible. You have, one life, and every day that person's living with that rare condition is an opportunity to learn something. And so it's really a tragedy when we see that data gets locked in safes and not used as much as it could, or if something catastrophic happens to a researcher and their data is locked in a database, that it's no longer available for others to learn from. And so at the heart of RDCA-DAP is the ability to break those walls down and make the data available to anybody who is interested, and also to spur interest, which Ed mentioned in his talk, which for a young researcher or investigator, that's a brilliant opportunity to impact the course of their professional trajectory.
Excellent, thank you, Pam. And building on that topic of maximum utility and power of the data, the point is that RDCA-DAP becomes the foundation for those insights to be gained, and for those insights to become actionable solutions that can help accelerate medical product development. And so with that in mind, I'm going to pick on Michelle now to comment, because you have also, from the vantage point of the agency, but specifically what you have seen across the board with the many solutions that you have been exposed to as you have been part of many collaborations, how it is also critical to think about how the data can be transformed into those solutions. And as we continue to navigate permissions for data accessibility, that the solutions can still happen, and that the bottom line is that the solutions are open source. Can you elaborate on that thought?
Yeah, thanks, Klaus. So when I think about potential for the solutions, and I'm really excited that the next session we'll be able to show some examples of what these solutions can look like. And they're only the beginning of potential solutions. I think that's really important to say, is that really I think as we begin to continue to look at the analytics and the possible solutions, and as more data comes in and we have a larger data pool, I think our ability to expand those solution options will continue to grow. And I think about Theresa's slide where she listed the challenges that start with heterogeneity down to powering of a trial. These are the solutions we want to try to solve these problems for. And so that is why this is an exciting time to be able to leverage data, continue to bring in new data, or if there's been an update to that database, send that on over too, because that's how we're being able to answer these questions. How we're being able to say, you know what, heterogeneity should not be the holdup now. We have a way to work with it and be able to design a trial that can account for it, to make sure then we're selecting the appropriate outcome assessment to support the clinical trial endpoint, or in some of the modeling examples for disease progression to better inform us of really maybe what that trial length is. So I think right now it's the beginning, and I think we get to see some examples of what there is there and the potential. And I think that we can continue to grow from that and expand as solution options. It will take time. But I think the one thing that Theresa said and that Ed said is that we need people to be contributors. You know, we need to work together in this effort. Everyone here is a stakeholder in this, including us at the agency. We're a stakeholder. We want to make sure we can give the best advice possible. And we can learn when we have these options, when data is pooled to really understand some of these disease progression things and things of that nature. So.
Perfect. That was actually a perfect setup for me asking Billy to elaborate on the notion of another original vision that RDCA-DAP and how we have moved to realize that vision, to make sure that the insights that can be gained are not just disease specific, but that can be cross-learned across multiple indications, and how that the fuel of the data through the engine of collaboration can spit out those solutions that are not just for a single disease, but that those learnings can be applied across many different disease types.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. That's a really important point that I was confident we were going to come to. By way of introduction, for those who don't know me, I'm Billy Dunn. I'm the director of the Office of Neuroscience. I guess we kind of had it on the screen, but we dispensed with introductions apparently. But I think it's important. I understand we have probably nearly 400 people online is what I heard. So congratulations to those of you who have journeyed out to make an in-person meeting happen today. You folks on this side are going to get my attention because somebody apparently installed an artificial sun over on this side of the room. Okay, so I'm completely unable to look that way. It's very painful. But we're really, really happy to be here. Again, I direct the Office of Neuroscience. I and my fantastic scientific staff who are rich in scientific expertise are responsible for considering these exact issues. And you know, most, not all, but most of the rare diseases are neurological, have neurological manifestations. Many of them affect children. And as we saw in Dr. Mullin's presentation, it's been really rewarding to see the expansion of interest, of development of scientific effort in this space. And the question you asked is so germane to that expansion of effort. I was listening to what Ed said at the beginning, and he made a common point, which is that with rare diseases, we're challenged. We have fewer numbers. And that I think historically has been a tremendous challenge. But one of the advantages of an effort like this and aggregating the data and bringing them together into a cohesive framework is the opportunity to discover things that we didn't even know existed. We certainly can bring more power to answering questions that we've prospectively identified as needing an answer. But just aggregating the data and being able to look at it might allow scientific discovery and lead to additional questions. And this speaks to what you're bringing up, Klaus. The point of the matter is that one of the reasons that we have seen this explosion of effort, we've seen increased commercial interest in addition to academic efforts, is because the science is evolving. This effort is part of that evolution of the scientific understanding, and it facilitates that. As the science evolves, we're able to understand the diseases more precisely, particularly their underlying biological basis. As we understand that, we can tie diseases together that might previously have been understood only by how they appeared to the world, the phenotypic presentation of the disease. When we understand the biologic basis, we can begin to aggregate these diseases in a way where there's shared molecular characteristics, shared pathophysiology, shared biology of the disease, and we can start to try to increase the size of the patients who are contributing to a given question. So we might not be limited to just that small number of patients for a given classically described disease. We might be able to think much more aspirationally about how to group patients together to answer questions based on shared underlying characteristics. Perhaps a clinical characteristic might give us a hint that there's a shared underlying biological characteristic. The extensive use of biomarkers and bringing in data that are data points that are reflective of that scientific understanding might allow us to put heretofore unrecognized similarities in diseases together. And then we can matrix those data and effectively have a less rare situation, a more strongly powered situation to explore the data. And then hopefully, ultimately, not only learn from that on a fundamental level or a basic level, but also apply those lessons in a way that we can then benefit development and eventual approval of new therapies for multiple patients who might share that characteristic. That's the aspiration. And I think it's very, very exciting. It reflects the evolved scientific understanding that we're going through now in neuroscience, and it's just a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, fantastic. So, Alex, you've been in the trenches trying to get those data together. So, one of the key things that I think we've learned is that just approaching the conversation that this is, data for data's sake is not the right way to approach the conversation, and how this is about making sure that the data have a purpose for everything that has been described. So I want you to comment on your experience in driving those conversations with the multiple stakeholders and some of the common denominator themes that you have heard from all those communities, even with very disparate diseases that have very different causes and different manifestations, but that seem to coalesce to those same topics.
Yes, thanks, Klaus. So that's a lot. I'm just going to start with the conversation and just talking about my experience driving these conversations about data sharing with communities, starting as a rookie, handling this conversation probably not the right way and saying, do you have data you'd be willing to share? That's really not working, and it's also not the point. The point is, and this is what I'm doing right now in my conversation, each time I'm discussing with a new rare disease community, or I'm following up on conversations that I had previously, the point is really, we need to engage in a discussion with your entire community. We need to assess what has been collected. We need to assess what are the unmet needs of your community, and we need to try to drive this conversation together. So there's not a single path to that. I think a community can decide to engage with all their stakeholders on their own without me, or we can do it together. And I'm always offering my help, but I think this is really essential, is to think about the necessity to really come together within a community, engage everybody, and make a decision. You need to aggregate your data. You need to find a place for the data that has been collected. I would love for you to pick RDCA-DAP because I believe in the program. There are other opportunities for you to aggregate data, and you need to do it. Please do it with RDCA-DAP. But if you don't, we can still help you, and we can engage discussion with you, because the important part is, what do we do with it? What are the unmet needs? What can we do using the data that has been collected? Do we have enough? If we don't, what do we need to do to collect more data? And how do we collect this data? So some of the important efforts that we are doing with NORD is about maximizing the use of registry data and making sure the future collections are robust enough to make an impact. And we need to engage in standardization of data, standardization of best collection of data. All of that is very relevant. So I think that's the one part. Common denominator that I'm finding in rare disease communities. I mean, the first one is the need. I think I've never talked to a rare disease community that doesn't have a need. That clearly there's a lot to be done. And I think this is why it's important to come and work as a community. And RDCA-DAP really tries to bring the entire ecosystem with us, because there's so much to be done that we need to collaborate. I think that's really the main denominator, are the needs After that, I'm seeing some conversations that are coming back often. A lot of communities where, especially when you deal with pediatrics, they are tired of having their kids on a placebo. So building natural history controls comes a lot in my conversations. That's one. Then I have a lot of discussions about the collection. What GUI system do we need to use to de-identify your patients? That's coming a lot too. So I think it's coming from all fronts. It's coming from the needs to understand disease better, the need for better tool for drug development, but also the needs for better tool and hints and guides and guidelines to collect the data.
Great. And so I think that sets me up for Theresa. You mentioned in your presentation, and at the end of the day, I mean, this was your original dream to make this happen. One of the things that is also clear, and you made that point in your presentation, is that the reality of drug development for rare diseases evolves continuously. And how do you see RDCA-DAP not only keeping up with that evolution, but also helping shape that evolution and make sure that we're ahead of the curve for where the needs are going to be and how those can be solved for the benefit of the patients?
Thanks, Klaus, for that challenging question. So, I mean, I think what RDCA-DAP is, what you're planning to do and what you're doing with building out the platform and trying to figure out how to continue to accommodate and bring in diverse data sources, especially some of the newer ones that are very exciting and may offer new ideas for endpoints, imaging data and the genomic data, the kinds of data that are on your slide, but they're out there. So to me, the piece that Alex is describing, continuing to do outreach to groups to have them be aware, and as Pam noted, we consider the patient's information to be this fairly precious resource, and we want the patients to know. I mean, I think, if we've had altogether, approaching 100 between patient-focused drug development meetings and the externally led meetings, hearing many of the externally led, about half of the ones that FDA has conducted, and most of the ones that are externally led, patient groups have led, have been on rare diseases. And, you hear how terrible and challenging it is for families and parents with their child suffering from a condition, and they feel, I mean, you want to do everything you can. We want to do everything we can. We know their families want to do everything they can. And so I think one thing here is knowing that, and we tell drug companies, plan early, plan ahead, think down the road. When you're going to do a trial, just plan carefully from the beginning. And I think one of the things one of our messages emerging for patients is that your data and information is this incredibly valuable resource that we want to support and have NORD and C-Path support to have you also know that this is a resource that can help make the quality of development programs for your disease better. And that, your data and how that's collected and the quality of that can make it better and increase the success. So I think for the program, to me, it's continuing to make the whole ecosystem, I'll say, aware of this as a resource, that these new types of data, these other forms of data are being contributed, that you guys are basically making it analysis ready. I mean, the standardization, the data has to be correctly sort of coded, to make sure it's analyzed correctly. So all that work on the back end, and hopefully over time it comes in standardized format, so there's less of that. But all that has to be done on the back end. So we need every part of the system to be kind of activated, if you will, to continue to move it forward, I think.
Klaus, could I comment also? I want to build on what Dr. Mullin said. I think it's such an important question, and really thoughtful comments from Dr. Mullin. And, I really heard your question And it spoke to me in terms of something that we talk about a lot, which is these efforts are dynamic. They're alive, they're living. They have to not only evolve over time, but keep up with knowledge. And this is something that I bring up an awful lot in a variety of forums, so it's worth a comment. So often we see scientific efforts that are launched and they have a start point and an end point, and then they get cited and they represent a conclusion. But let's talk about kind of a practical application where this often occurs, particularly in rare diseases. We often have a desire to consider the behavior or the expected behavior of a patient population in comparison to a similar patient population that was described historically. That seems to make a lot of sense. It does make a lot of sense. And you can do a lot with that. You can predict how your patients are going to behave in your trial to determine how long your trial should be, how many patients you might need in the trial. Some people even like to try to compare how patients do in the trial to that group historically. It seems rather evident that if we have a group, and I'll just do something kind of exaggerated for the point, if we have a group that was observed from 1960 to 1970 and behaved a certain way with their disease during that time, and if that's the best group that was ever observed, and now we treat somebody with a new drug, and we want to say, well, how does that look compared to how patients do naturally? If that's our best case control group to go look at, well, there's a lot that's happened since 1970, right? So keeping the data alive and contemporaneous with the other scientific efforts going on is critical. And that's something that hasn't been thought about as much. And we rely on what we have. So this happens all the time. We have scientists and sponsors come to us and say, well, we've looked at this, this notable, very definitive, well-respected group. And often it gets more and more out of date. And so that group might not even have even what you called a patient with a disease back then might have evolved since, right? I was talking about that biological understanding of the disease. They may not represent patients with the disease that's actually being called something similar today in terms of how we would go about identifying and diagnosing those patients. So what's great about this is I think we've built that in advance. We have an opportunity to recognize that this is not we're funding this, we're committing to it, we're interested in this, and all these wonderful organizations have come together to support this for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, we're going to have a nice little present and we're going to wrap it up and then we're done. That's not, this is really indefinite. And what that means is we have to have a receptivity to the evolution of knowledge and an ability to incorporate that knowledge back into our understanding, to ask new questions, to provide new degrees of understanding for the diseases, and then rapidly translate that new understanding, that evolved understanding, into the scientific efforts and the development pathways that are emanating from that very work. So it's a very, it's quite a bit of a feedback loop involved, and it's a very receptive, dynamic, alive opportunity and effort. And I think it's really indicative of how we try to approach so many of things. Naturally, some efforts do have a start and an end point. We have to realize that. But the questions we're asking are not so simple, right? I mean, if a bunch of scientists got together and decided, okay, we're going to test whether, is this table right here square or round? Right. And we could get together and we could size it up and we could do some things. We're going to come to an answer at the end and say, okay, it's round. We're done. That's good. And I think we can accept that. But there's so much more amorphous what's happening with diseases. There's so many things that we need to think about. And we're usually going to have, the more knowledge comes in, generally, it amplifies the opportunity for what we're trying to explore. Usually you have more opportunities and more unanswered questions that you need to go pursue with that new knowledge. So I wanted to kind of address that because I think it's one of the real strengths that we're trying to bring to this effort up front is the dynamic nature, the ability to remain contemporaneous with evolving knowledge so that when we do want to tap the data to answer those questions that I just described, hey, how is this patient behaving compared to an external comparison group? It's as current as we can be and as useful as it can be.
Right. No, that was beautiful, Billy. Thank you for that. Pam, you have, again, that unique perspective of all the different communities that are at different stages of their journey in thinking about their condition, thinking about the science behind their condition. And so I want to go back to you and get your comments on that aspect of how what Billy just said links to what you see day to day with your communities and how the platform is helping that.
I couldn't agree more with Billy's comments, because the clinical standards of care, if we're doing our job out in the field caring for these patients, it's going to change over time. We're actually seeing that with some of the data that we submitted early on. We, as Ed said, with our program, we've developed an API to allow us to send data in, and it goes through this cleansing process that Theresa mentioned, that the C-Path data scientist team oversee. We are now getting to the point where we're adding more information that people have learned since the initial submission. And that's the whole point of making this a living, breathing thing. And I'll just put my 2 cents in. There's lots of great data projects out there, and they will continue to occur and evolve over time. But this is FDA saying to the rare disease community, we want to help accelerate drug development. We see the problems and the challenges that exist, and there are, in some cases, things we can do about addressing them. And Theresa had a great slide that summarized them. And this is an amazing opportunity to tackle those issues with this program. And so I'm just going to reinforce the idea that you could engage in this program and not be limited to only this program. If you wanted to do other things with your organization, with your study, with your projects, you're adding to something that has a robust, not only history, but future, and it has the regulatory oomph behind it. And at the end of the day, most patients and families want to live their best life and be as healthy as possible, and enjoy other aspects of their life. Not every patient and family is an advocate, and that's okay too. And this is an opportunity for them to participate in helping change the dialogue, change the course and direction of their condition.
Right. No, that fantastic. Thank you, Pam, for that. Linking to that, Michelle, again, the notion of patient-focused drug development linked to the comments that have been made, and things that you and I discussed with Kevin as well, about the evolving nature of how we think about those diseases, even if in the categories of what you define being at a particular stage of a particular disease, even if the criteria remain the same as you refine the quantitation, you may actually find subpopulations within that subpopulation, and how that all factors into the thinking of patient-focused drug development. Do you want to elaborate on that thought?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of continuation, this theme of the evolution opportunity with the platform and contributing data, and how we have to evolve with time with this, because the science is advancing and we absolutely have to be part of that, and should hopefully maybe be driving it as well with this platform. And to your point, I think about, we need to take the lessons learned to what Pam is describing, that they've already learned in just a small amount of time since they've contributed data, and recognizing where are some unmet needs and how we collect information, or do we need to reframe what we're collecting because the science has evolved. And I think that goes to Dr. Dunn's point about, if we're relying back on data from the 60s and 70s to compare it to now, why we need to be open to the evolution and collecting of our natural histories, because it has changed, it is evolving. And I think to your point, Klaus, about, when we start looking at the data and we're starting to see subtypes emerging, or how we describe it differently, because maybe there's now that new genetic test that has evolved over time. And we're seeing this definitely in the PFDD meetings. I will say that when we get the requests that come in from Dr. Mullin's office to say, hey, would you guys support? And we always support our meetings. We're always there in attendance. We're seeing a lot more where it is these more genetic subtypes coming in from maybe a bigger group. I like to use my rare epilepsies as the example right now, because that is a really booming area. And there's a lot of the rare epilepsies that have the genetic component, and they're coming out and they're finding out that there's new genetics tied to it and stuff. And so I think that's just, we have to be open to the evolution of not only what that science is, but we know that that is what we're seeing, I would say, in PFDD right now, is these communities who now found their selves with other similar families, and there may be really small numbers, but they want their voices to be heard too. And so the great part about this effort is that, you know, our rare diseases vary in the size and shape of what they look like, but any contribution can be done, because I do think in some of these smaller ones, to what Dr. Dunn was saying about the family concepts, right? Can we look at some of families of diseases could be informative to us. So I think PFDD is always tied to our initiatives, and it's tied, it may not seem obvious to folks how it's tied to here, but in the end, if we take the simple mission of what PFDD is supposed to be, it's ultimately patient level data that we should be getting and be able to use it to help inform drug development.
Yeah, awesome. Now, Alex, you've worked in the trenches, as you've indicated, to get those existing data sets into the platform. But you've also been in the trenches working to make sure that future data collection exercises, prospectively speaking, are embracing some of the concepts that maximize the shareability of the data, and that also maximize the information value of the data. So that's another component of what RDCA-DAP's mission is. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I think my colleague Romana might be better suited for that, but I'll try. You know, one of the things that we've been doing consistently as we get these data sets in is, you know, the team works very hard. It's a very involved effort to integrate the data into the platform, because as we mentioned, it is not a repository. It is more than that. It is a specific format intended to maximize the use and the utility of the data. And so there is all that ongoing effort from the team on each data set to curate, clean, integrate the data that yields lessons learned. And we've provided to communities feedback on these collections, you know, some, so to speak, gap analytical of the collections to tell them what went wrong, what went bad, what could you do better, what standards, you know, should you embrace. So we've been doing that. And I heard Michelle Obidi say it takes time. It does take time, but we're seeing, finally, we're starting to see some previous data contributors telling us, yes, we made some changes. I had someone recently from a rare epilepsy foundation telling me, yes, we implemented some of your recommendations for data collection, and we're going to get the update soon. So we're just starting to see it. And I'm really hoping that, you know, we'll be able to compare and kind of communicate around, okay, like this is a case example where we made impact by providing recommendations that led to a better collection.
Fantastic. And so, Theresa, back to you. One of the key things that I know the agency and industry and we collectively as a community want to make sure that we also include in clinical research in general is the notion of inclusiveness and diversity. And so this additional learning that is happening for how to optimize things for future data collections, from your vantage point where you see those things happening in the trenches in drug development, can you comment on how you're seeing that also evolving?
Well, I think that first of all, most rare disease populations are very diverse in terms of the patients who experience them. But I think that some of the things that we're trying to do will to make trials more accessible, to make it easier for people to participate, and even patient-focused drug development meetings, which we have a big virtual component now, has really made it easier for patients across the income, demographic, racial, and other cultural spectrum to participate, because they can join online, or we're moving, during the pandemic, we began to have move toward decentralized trials to the extent possible. So I think that these are other components that are just being built in that are going to help us improve accessibility. I think the other piece I want to mention here is that this platform is a really critical component of FDA and in particular CDER's approach to try to, we have a sort of, I'll call it all center approach to trying to improve and accelerate rare disease drug development. And you probably have heard about the ARC, which is the Accelerating Rare Disease Cures effort. And this is spearheaded by Dr. Terry Jo Lee. And I want to mention it because we see this platform as a critical component, but one of the components in a larger effort that we're undertaking, which include a number of other things as well, that some have to do with policy, that have to do with rare disease drug development and regulatory decision making. Some of it's outreach and education to other stakeholders. Michelle mentioned that there are a lot of stakeholders, including FDA is a stakeholder, but academic researchers, sponsors, including small first-time perhaps drug developers who may not have a lot of regulatory experience. So we are doing outreach and education we've been talking about our patient stakeholders. They're critically important to us, but I don't want people to think that we're not trying to reach out to every component in this really important ecosystem that has to all be knitted up together as much as possible. It tends to be kind of siloed and fragmented. So, and that includes learnings across our review divisions, as well as learnings across disease areas. So I think that we're trying to bring things together at every level. And so I just want to mention that as well. And I think that's important too, because that helps us with the diversity and inclusion component also. Over.
Perfect. Billy, one thing that you've heard me say this, I found pretty visionary on your part after the 2018 reorg by having the inclusion in your office of not just the clinical review expertise, but also outcomes research expertise and model-informed drug development expertise. And I think that speaks to this entire notion of the integration of disciplines. And I think we are seeing that come to life as part of RDCA-DAP, but as you have also seen that happen within the agency, can you comment on how you see that moving into the future for the platform?
Sure, I think I can comment at a high level on that. That question is also really germane for Dr. Campbell and Dr. Curtis when he's on his panel later. As experts in those areas, we are fortunate to have some of that focused expertise in my office. That's really relevant. And I think it's important because those tools and techniques provide an opportunity for us to extract the maximum amount of knowledge from a given data set that's intended to support an argument that a drug, in my case, a drug is effective. And bringing the appropriate expertise to bear on how to generate those data from the beginning and how to maximally interpret in a valuable, rigorous way those data serves patients well, right? We would hate to have, this keeps me up at night, the fact that an answer might reside in a body of data and we don't know that it's there. We don't know how to look for it. We don't recognize it. Like one of those illusion images where, depending on how you look at it, you see somebody older or younger, or, a different colored dress, whatever it might be. I hate to think that we're only seeing one of the visions that resides there when there's actually multiple things that we could see. So we need to bring all the tools that we have together to understand this. Further, some of these tools, patient-focused drug development, clinical outcomes assessments, these benefit from the type of work that RDCA-DAP is doing. They allow us to more maximally inform our considerations of not only what's important, but how to measure what is important. The model-informed issues that you brought up kind of speak to the broader role of pharmacometric analyses and our considerations of data. And again, using the, and I know this is near and dear to you, Klaus. I don't need to tell you about this, but folks need to recognize that, again, in that theme of what answers, what discoveries reside within data sets. These are powerful tools for extracting the maximum amount of information that we can use. And they might not be as familiar to folks that are outside that arena, but they're very strong. And so what we can do is, by bringing this expertise at the agency to bear on neurological diseases specifically, we can ensure that we're building in the opportunity in our development programs to generate the data in a way that ultimately will be actionable for us downstream. And we can find persuasiveness in data that brings together these perhaps thought to be disparate sources. But as we talked before, if we aggregate them and look for patterns in those data, we can actually potentially find some very strong evidence, some important discoveries, and those discoveries and evidence can be everything from hypothesis generating or informative for the design of studies to conclusive type considerations, where we might actually end up being able to use those techniques to render a decision about whether a drug is or isn't likely to be beneficial to patients. So there's a tremendous amount to that. I think we're going to have a session that speaks to some of these issues, and I know it's a strength of what your organization does and you yourself do. So I wouldn't presume to try to get into the depths of that here, but they are powerful techniques, and we want, essentially, in a nutshell, we want to leverage every opportunity we have to kind of poke and prod the data and see what it tells us.
Excellent. Okay, so we have been discussing this with the panel, but I'd like to open up the floor for the audience to comment, please. I knew I could count on you.
Klaus and Charlene knew I was going to come up here. 2 questions. The first one, Theresa and Michelle, you raised this as someone who is a drug developer. This is very near and dear to my heart, all of the concerns that you raised. But this question is for you, Billy. And it's about endpoints. And yes, heterogeneity is something we think about. I am super, super, super sensitive, and Charlene knows this, about trial burden. But when it comes to endpoints, the hard part is we constantly get this measure what's meaningful. We also have different stakeholders. So the question, Billy, is, we have what's meaningful to clinicians, what's meaningful to patients, what's meaningful to caregivers, what's meaningful scientifically. And because this is something I want to get right and don't want to just randomly collect data, can you comment on how do we merge meaningfulness?
You pivoted. I thought you were going to ask Michelle and Theresa that question. And then I heard my name come up. Dr. Campbell is saying, I can start. I will speak to your question, but if you'd like to say something, please do.
I can start. So it is a balance. And I think that this is something that I've been talking about a lot more lately when I talk to patient groups about this balance, because we are out there saying what matters most to patients, right? And what matters most to this. But we also have to make sure we understand, what is my drug or treatment supposed to do? And so I need to make sure I'm measuring what the drug and treatment is supposed to do. And so it is this fine act of balancing what is important to the patients and to communities. And ultimately, we are measuring something that's important to them. It may not be the top priority, right? But what is my treatment supposed to do? What is it supposed to impact? And how does that make sense in the trial design? And so I do think that we do need to think of it as a balance, and that's okay. We're ultimately going to be measuring something that is important. We always want to make sure that when we are looking at an endpoint and looking at, is there clinical benefit, it is always tied back to the patient, and is it meaningful to them? So it is a fine act. It truly is. It is that's my conversation that keeps me up at night is, how do we balance it? How do we, when we get something that comes in and I've got 10 outcome assessments, that want to be assessed because of heterogeneity, and you just know the burden is going to be too much. It's just going to be really a lot. So what makes sense for the population? What is most likely the information that can be collected well and can be collected over time well and be interpretable? So that is what my struggles are, because I think about this all the time. is how do we find that right balance and make sure it makes sense. And so I think this is why I always start having the conversations with the patient group so they understand that it is a balance and we do care, and ultimately we're going to get there, but we have to think about what is actually the treatment going to look like, or, you know, because we want to make sure we're measuring the success. If it's a successful treatment, we do not want to be missing that. So I will now turn it back over to Dr. Dunn and see if he wants to add, but that is what keeps me up at night actually, is how do we find that balance?
I want to respect your question, so I'm going to add to what but it's hard to add much to that. I agree with what Dr. Campbell said very strongly. And I just want to reiterate a couple of the points, which is that we are patient-centric. Okay, we as a scientific, not just we at the FDA, we should be patient-centric. That's not always how we've been. There's been a tremendous amount of paternalism historically. That really doesn't fly. All right, there's certain circumstances when a patient is incapable by virtue of their disease to speak for themselves. We have to do the best we can. But as a rule, we are absolutely patient-centric. And I get really indignant on behalf of patients when I see a provider, a physician, a clinician, somebody say, I know what's best for you, patient. And the patient's like, it's my disease. This is important to me. So we are really responsive, and I think this is exactly what Dr. Campbell was discussing, to patient input. We want to respect the primacy of the patient voice. Meaningfulness, we do this every day. It's important. We want to make sure that something that we're exposing folks to as a treatment is worth it. But there's lots of ways to consider that. Patients are very articulate. People who are experiencing diseases are very knowledgeable about their disease. They're very articulate about what matters. Sometimes it's not what the textbooks teach us. And I think it can be a real eye-opening experience. And so I am very forward in making sure that we take that into account. But again, this is kind of our daily work. We talk, you're a developer, we talk with folks that come in, we think about meaningfulness, trying to make sure that a given treatment has the potential in the study design and what's being measured to give us a conclusion that it's beneficial to the patient in a meaningful way. That's admittedly subjective, but I think we do a pretty good job at it, and we try to make sure that we're respecting, the patient's voice. We simply, I read all the time about, people will, I saw it, I forget where I saw it, just yesterday I saw it in something I was asked to review, but it talked about basically, that we're going to be responsive to the patient and the provider's, assessment of what's important. And that's fine. That's important input. Providers can provide, give us substantial important information to help with these assessments, but the patient's voice is really critical. And so we keep that in mind. There's a lot of nuance to this. These discussions can get very complex. The tools that we use to assess these effects can be very sophisticated, but as a principle, that's critical. And I hope that helps to address your question.
No, it does. And that's, I'm actually grateful for it, because you're right. We do have providers who think their voice should be loudest. And that's a balance. And in fact, we've done the research where we ask the different stakeholders, what is meaningful to you? And the answers are not the same. And that's why I had to post that.
It's not always insidious either, right? I mean, people can be very well intentioned. We have situations that we encounter where partners and caregivers of folks with terrible diseases, rightly and completely understandably from their perspective, think that an approach to measuring an impact on the disease that, unbeknownst to them, it will help their experience of the disease, perhaps not taking into account how it does or doesn't affect the patient's experience. We can't make decisions based on that. That may be a very important corollary, and we certainly like to think about that. But benefiting a caregiver, for instance, that might be a strong indicator that a drug is doing something. Again, this isn't inherently bad, but these nuances of perspective are really important for us to consider in keeping the patient first.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot to my second question, which is for you, Klaus and Alex. And it goes back to the question that you raised to Theresa, which is very important for me personally. The diversity of trials. And the truth is, most people have no idea what a trial is in general. And so have you all thought about using this platform as a way to introduce trials outside of the need to have a drug. I mean, that probably would be the best way, because we've had a lot of conversations with patients about this idea, and many of them say that it does scare them, but they're open to the idea. But I think that non-drug trials would be a great way to introduce a lot of the people who have not been participating in the process to maybe become familiar before a drug trial. But I don't know, have you guys thought about that?
Yes, that was a great question. Thank you. My drug forum partner always thinking about those things. So the answer is yes, but the answer comes with additional qualifiers. And I'll start and I'll pass it probably to Pam first and then to Alex. A big component of this platform in the graph that Theresa envisioned in the beginning was to include data sources that came from real world sources and observational studies. Those are absolutely important. We really want to understand the long-term dynamics of a condition and all the learnings that we've discussed that could be extracted. But at the same time, that involves that education components. Education meant in a good way, not in a I'm just going to talk to you and you better learn what I'm telling you. But from the grassroots, understand what the needs are and how that can spearhead some of those interests. So I'll turn over to Pam, because you do that on a daily basis. So I'll let you comment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it goes back to at the community level, people being curious about what's going on in their community. And there are lots of tools out there, including NORD's program, I Am Rare, where they could begin to explore and what's taking place in their community. Maybe they have a hypothesis about one thing or another relative to their condition or conditions, because some of them are groups. But maybe they don't, and they just want to know baseline, where are people at? What are their experiences? And I've seen lots of different examples of how they've maneuvered through that journey. And it's just amazing to see, one of the first groups I worked with, they were intensely focused on, these are the things we want to ask ourselves. These are the things we wanted. And then, so they did it. They launched a pretty elaborate study in the first version. And then what did they discover 6 to 9 months in? They got a lot of good response for the size of the organization. There was an issue around oral health that people weren't talking about collectively or looking at collectively. They were more focused on, the tumor-based issues that, things that were much more readily measurable and prolific. So that ended up, allowing the community, before anybody was doing any research on this condition, public or private, to pursue some more questions in that regard. So to your very point, that is a wonderful way to start, and you don't have to wait until a trial for a therapy. And we recommend, and we know the FDA has mentioned this, for as long as I've been involved in our program at NORD, start early, begin engaging with your community before you have a therapy, because you will get results. There will be a lot will come from it beyond just the examples that I articulated. We're also looking at this notion of, don't assume because you put something out there on the web that people have access to it. So not in my group, but in the policy group at NORD, we're doing a lot around trying to ensure that advances we made in telehealth in COVID stick, so we can get we can meet people where they are relative to their care or their engagement in studies. We're also looking at, where are they not getting access to the internet, and can we leverage local clinics who reach out to, their community? So we're looking at this, where is the spider web broken? Where do we not have, where's the net missing? Where's got holes that we can bring people up, elevate everybody? And so hopefully that trickles down into the things that we've been talking about today. that they get engaged, they get involved, and they can make their contribution. And if they start small, maybe we can show through actual experience to alleviate their fears and concerns, which are real, and to be respected.
What else can I say? Thanks. I mean, most of that relates to the educational piece that really Nord is driving as part of the RDCA-DAP effort. Just a little note about the platform right now, as we continue to develop the platform, and we talked about evolving. So the platform is continuing to evolve and grow, technology speaking. We started really by building the platform for scientists and for people to develop, data scientists and analysts to develop solutions by providing tools on the platform. So it is mostly catered to them at the moment, but we intend to continue to branch out the interface for other populations of users. And so obviously patients is one of the key populations that we love in the future to have an interface for them and bring tools, which could be educational tools, and other means to kind of interface with the RDCA-DAP program and data.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent.
Oh my gosh. I don't say my name on purpose. So I'm Cherie Butts. I'm from Biogen.
Yes, please.
I'm Monica Weldon, and so I represent the SYNGAP1 Foundation. I don't know if I'm gonna throw you a doozy or not, but we have been working on our patient-focused drug development our report, and we decided to go back and try to correlate the data that we've collected, and we do have a NORD registry, and we're aggregating this data, and we took the top 5 most concerns from our patient community. And of course, you have to pick the lesser of 2 evils. And so my question is though we have the 5, we do have a molecule in pre-development right now, which is an ASO. And if this molecule comes out, of course, they're running animal model data on it now, but if it comes out of preclinical to a clinical trial design, for instance, if we can get it through and we find out the outcome measure or the biomarker that we choose, which we do have a validated sleep endpoint currently. We have 2 biomarkers identified in our EEG data, and then we have a GATE study that we are working on. If we see that we've picked an outcome measure and it's not really what we're doing, but we see another benefit using the same drug in one of the top 5 priorities, let's say behavior is one of the tops next to epilepsy or seizures, what would the FDA do in terms of pivoting to seeing an improvement in another outcome measure that we didn't select for the trial? Would they allow us to backtrack and redo a trial with the same drug? Did I just?
No.
I'm just curious. I mean, because I'm sorry, we're using a drug for a particular symptom now. However, we're seeing that drug give us benefits from a normal side effect of a person that may take it for a different indication.
All right, so you probably got everybody's heads here spinning
Sorry.
about all this, but I think what we need to do is take a step back from your specific development program, which we're not going to discuss here, obviously, and talk about some of the issues that you raise, which is that it's common, and I think this really speaks to what we were discussing before. I'm going to ask Dr. Campbell to comment a little bit on some of this as well, but it's common to recognize that this is what we were discussing, that we have to try to leverage these very precious data sets that we have that are difficult to obtain, difficult to generate, result from participants who are small in number, and provide us data that has to be looked at very carefully. It's common for us to encounter these situations where we kind of maybe second guess, some of our presumptions or assumptions that we made going into the trial. With that said, it's not uncommon at all for a given study to result in a situation where you have a sense of what you just described. Well, we were looking at this, but hey, look, we saw something useful here. And really what that comes down to is how persuasive is that? Usually those things can be reasonably thought of as saying that's fodder for going to look at that some more. But what do you do if you can't look at it anymore? Like, what if we have a disease that has 10 patients in the world? What do you do there? And we have that. We have these situations that we encounter. So each one has to be contextualized within its own situation, sort out what can be learned from the study, what's appropriate for further study, further exploration, refinement of hypotheses. We don't want to turn a blind eye to anything that could be informative, but we also have to be sure, not because we're the FDA, but because we're all scientists. We're all caring about making sure that we have good, truthful, persuasive answers that are going to benefit the folks who are going to basically use whatever therapy is being tested. We want to make sure that that's rigorously evaluated in the context of the nuances of the situation that's in front of us. So it's really difficult to give a specific answer to all the various points that you made. But I'll reassure you that the general description that you provided, it's not uncommon. And usually unfortunately, a lot of times when you see something that kind of crop up, oh, but we saw this, sometimes when that gets looked at, in a supplementary way or in an additional way, it might not pan out quite the way it did in this first time you saw it. So how you put all these data together can be very complicated. But I think the overriding theme is that we want to make sure that we recognize how precious each of these data points are, especially in this space, and learn as much as we can from them. And that's a consistent theme that I think we've all been bringing up here for this effort. When you think about the RDCA-DAP and then specifically the DAP portion of it, it provides an opportunity maybe to bring in external data to help try to understand this observation, right? So we might have an opportunity, whereas perhaps years ago we might have kind of had a little bit of a narrow focus, that all we can understand is what is in front of us. Maybe you saw something that looks promising, and maybe that opens up a door for further consideration and contextualization from a broader data set that even you didn't originally anticipate. We want to be open-minded about that, but we still have to be rigorous, of course. Right? Michelle, I don't know if you want to say anything.
I don't know how much more to add other than to say that is kind of, I feel like, our everyday. I feel like that is our everyday. This is the common question. We face it every day. And so we are familiar with it. And we are thoughtful. We try to take the best thoughtful approach. I think this is why when we talk about come early and talk to us is for this reason. Because when we know we have limited number of patients and we may only have one or two opportunities, we want to be able to provide the best advice possible. And so we may want to look at a couple of different things to measure. For example, we may want to see, is this effect, short-term or long-term? What are the things? So I think we bring the expertise because and Dr. Dunn's right, we have a very well-diverse of expertise in our office, that we will come together and we have these very dynamic conversations. I feel like I say every day about how to answer that question. So, I think it's not, while it seems not as a concern for you, it's not as always a concern for us because we are always thoughtful about this. We recognize this happens in programs. It's not uncommon, and that we think about this and try to provide the best advice based on what the data says at that time, and learn from that and continue that dialogue, I would say, which is why we encourage this early conversation. So that's all I have to add there.
Great. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Raymond Perini. I'm from the Milken Institute. So there's a lot of data that's out there, either from the preclinical or clinical space, from either academic or industry partners. And I know that in some cases there might be a competitive environment going on here. But what has been kind of your experience with trying to engage these partners to get some of their data sources that either is collected or that may be collected in the future, and kind of how you're thinking about or maybe what successes have you seen so far and how you're thinking about some of the challenges that might come up as you're trying to get some of the data from either of these two stakeholder groups?
Awesome. Alex, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I guess this one is for me. can you remind me the two stakeholder groups you mentioned?
Academic researchers
Yeah.
or industry
Okay.
stakeholders.
Well, so I started by a few months ago, starting to tell people, when we talk about data sharing, I only see one good reason not to share data. I don't think I see any now. The one good reason I usually mention is consent. Well, when the data was already collected, did they collect the proper consent? There are ways around it, especially when you talk about industry data. I think sometimes, it would be my opinion, but I think sometimes industry hide behind the consent issue not to share data with us. But it's a legitimate point. There's blocks all over the place, a lot of reasons. I think really what we try to do as a program and a platform, when we install the governance, we try to really carefully considered and developed over time to address all the blocks that we face. That's why I'm saying I don't see a good reason, because as an academic, the reason that comes often is publication, where we can embargo, we can embargo the data until your publication is submitted. We have all the means. And again, it is a flexible sharing. So we can keep the data confidential. We can focus on developing work, which is what we need to do for patients. And then, change the governance over time and open the data if the contributors are willing to open the data once the publication is done, once we did a drug development tool. So that's really what we're trying to achieve with how we handle data sharing. So, it's not a simple answer. People talk about sharing all the time. There are a lot of different reasons. Sometimes, it's easier with industry. I think, I found it in my experience slightly easier to discuss sharing with industry and get data shared, at least the control arms. With foundation, it's another stakeholder, come with other issues, such as sustainability of their collection effort. So the prospective part is really important, and we wanted to have a breakout session tomorrow. We couldn't have it, but we're going to have some webinars upcoming at RDCA-DAP about consent and about working to help people that collect data input the proper consent into their collection form, so that prospectively sharing is enabled to platform like RDCA-DAP.
Yes, Theresa, you want to?
I would just add to that, well, two things. First of all, for academic researchers, not all of them, of course, are funded by NIH, but we have been working pretty closely with our colleagues at NIH and the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. They're very interested also in trying to make sure that the data that their researchers are collecting is used and helps advance cures. So that's another element. And I think another component is that we also, along the lines of what Alex said, want to make sure that patients are aware and know that there's an opportunity when they're being asked to enroll or participate in studies to have a conversation. And in fact, if we can give them some tools to know what that what they might want to talk about and what they might want to indicate about how they would like their data to be used, that's another important point in that process, and that they can have an influence on the maximum use of their data to advance drug development for their disease.
Yes, thank you. Penny, please.
Just the tools that you reference to help patients in that navigation with trial as they're enrolling in the trial, I think is a really exciting one to also figure out what can be shared more broadly, other than just maybe templates for informed consent. But my question was actually a follow-up. Dr. Dunn spoke very eloquently earlier about how exciting it is to be learning as much as we can from every data source, and that we are in many ways still at the cusp of understanding most of these rare diseases. And then Dr. Betourne also spoke very eloquently about, please put your data into RDCA-DAP, right? And there's a bit of a balance that I see where a lot of the folks who drive the research to understand the condition are not, at least those that we see from the advocacy space, a lot of times those are the academic researchers, right? And so there's this interplay and this back and forth. Is this better? I see. there's an interplay or a back and forth around how do you make sure that all of the different stakeholders who would want to use the data for different purposes are indeed maximally able to do so in a responsible way. And I think and see kind of the vision with RDCA-DAP, but can you talk about what's your intention to really reach out to some of those researchers who are actively doing a ton of research on understanding disease progression so that they can better understand how they can work with RDCA-DAP?
Well, that's a great question. I'm going to take it so that we can entertain the last question and then we can close the session. So in terms of making sure that we have a broad outreach, that broad outreach can take many different forms, and you're going to hear in the next session and then the subsequent panel. I'm going to put a plug for what Ron is going to comment on, how things have informed, how the platform has informed the thinking of researchers that are setting up their observational studies and their molecular studies, et cetera, to make sure that they cater to answering specific questions that are as of yet unanswered based on what we have seen in existing data being integrated. So that's one. The second, making sure that when they're thinking about setting up their research strategy, they think about the data infrastructure component, which is a lot of times in an academic setting a bit of an afterthought. And now it's becoming more of a sexy thing that actually gives a competitive edge when you're thinking about funding. And so that's a way to keep them attracted. And then the third part is that one of the things that Alex mentioned is this. If you talk to industry scientists, they cannot wait to share data. We just need to make sure that we work through the legal departments to ensure that they're okay with the transferring of the data. When you talk to academic researchers, the tech transfer attorneys are like, yeah, why are we even discussing this? It's the academic researcher that, because of the incentives, they don't want to get scooped because they're after tenure, and that's just the way things are. We're not looking to change that model, but work with that model to ensure that if they are looking to share data with us, they have all the reassurances that they're not going to get scooped and that their tenure is not going to be in danger by them sharing data with us. So that's very quickly what that, I hope that answered that question, Penny.
Hi, sorry to be standing with the sun behind me again. Susan Ward, I run an initiative that's a collaborative endeavor in neuromuscular disease that's partly pre-competitive and partly not. And I guess that's kind of where I want to go to. I was thrilled, Dr. Mullin, to see your slide that expanded from pharmacometric models, which we're very familiar with from critical path, into those issues around heterogeneity, increasing power, being able to really, and as Dr. Dunn said, really understand whether, historical controls, how much risk do they carry, etc. Those are all huge, big endeavors, and especially if you're doing them over so many different rare diseases. And so I guess there's two questions here. One is there's so much going on in outside of critical path and NORD, and it's hard to know what everyone is doing, but some of these questions may have been answered in pockets here or pockets there. There may be other data, and we know there are other data sources, like Vivli and Project Datasphere, and at different levels of the, if you like, the value chain of what it takes to solve these problems. So I guess what I'm asking is, there's two things. One is it's hard to know when everything else is happening in the world, and yet there's information there that I think you would probably, everybody would benefit from, as you were saying about feed forward of knowledge and incorporation. So I'm wondering how you might address systematically or systemically, if you like, how you might be able to go about bringing together those additional pieces. And then maybe it's taking it a step too far, But my experience is that the tools are really, really important. But to really help the industry, you need to kind of help them apply those tools to their own specific situation, which gets into a not entirely pre-competitive space. And I don't know whether that's something you have considered, how you might deal with that.
Just so you know, Billy's right. There's this light shining on us. It's almost blinding. So it's kind of hard to find the button on this. I'm going to have after images for a long time, I think. But what, we don't want to go like, like that's not really nice, but I'll try to take a shot at some of what you're saying. And then I'm going to look to Dr. Dunn and Dr. Campbell to correct me if I say something incorrect. Okay. But in my way, and because they are actually involved directly in review and I'm not, but my understanding of this is that basically we're building this platform and it's, of course, pre-competitive, and that's how the data is being included, et cetera. And there's very careful kind of data contribution agreements that are made with each contributor and who can access the data and how it can be used, and all that's very carefully handled. But to the way I think about it is, we're building this platform. We aspire to have it be used across diseases. We aspire to learn, and in fact, C-Path's worked very hard to build rare disease ontologies that actually could work across all those different diseases, which is really quite challenging. But to me, we're building it one disease at a time. You know what I mean? I mean, you got to build it somehow. So if we're getting these contributions with the desire to have it be essentially informing us over time as we learn more, as the science evolves, as the data contributions grow, and we're really able to just learn more from that data and gain more from it, gain insights from it. That's a resource that can be used by developers, whether it's academic who aspires to be a sponsor, or and maybe becomes a small company in the process, or whatever, or it's a larger company with a rare disease, kind of interest. So I think that what we see is this is a platform that's available for that kind of support, okay? And that you still are going to have for a development program, obviously, that confidential and individual conversation when they come in to meet with FDA, which we said come early, perhaps come often, depends, but come early so that we can avoid potential for redo something that didn't, go well. So then you have that conversation with the company about its development program. And there's, and it may be you're referencing this resource, this platform that maybe they didn't know about, maybe they aren't using it, maybe they have data. So I see a lot of ways that this resource is there to be contributed to and used pre-competitively potentially, but also it can be used in the context of a development program. And FDA, of course, this is where we want our community inside FDA to be fully aware of what's in there and what's not, to see when it makes sense and when it can be helpful. And then there are other consortia at C-Path as well. Some of them may also, there's a rare disease, clinical outcome assessment group as well. And so there are various things. So I think these are, to me, tools that are there, resources that, may be applicable in the context of a development program where obviously now that becomes competitive. So now I'm going to turn to Dr. Dunn, Dr. Campbell to tell me to just sort of paper it over if that didn't come out right, but that's how I see it.
No wallpaper needed. We certainly wouldn't correct anything that you said, and I'm spot on comments and I'm conscious of the time. Dr. Romero, I actually think you don't need to turn it over to us. I think a lot of that commentary is actually directed at the operational aspects of the effort, and so really I think Dr. Romero probably can put a cap on not only the session, but maybe a few comments to address that. I think that's really really more in your arena there, and there's a lot of good information, but I do recognize the time as well.
Yes. So yeah, we need to draw this to a close, but I encourage you, Susan, to connect with us, especially with Jeff and me, about an exciting training effort that is going to come out soon on the use of those innovative tools. And so stay tuned for more, and you'll hear about those things throughout the next day and a half. So with that, we close it, and thank you to the panelists. That was fantastically done.